Welcome to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio coverage of NTC 2015, the Nonprofit Technology Conference. We're in day 2. We're in Austin, Texas at the Convention Center, and my guest is Dar Veverka. She's Vice President of Technology for LIFT, L-I-F-T, and her workshop topic is Avoiding Disaster, a practical guide for backup systems and disaster recovery planning. Dar, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. This day 2, we're highlighting one swag item at NTC per interview, and I have a double chip biscotti from Sputnik Moment. The hashtag is Sputnik Smiles, and I'm told that the glasses go with the biscotti, so this is essential. This is this interview's swag moment. Thank you very much, Sputnik Smiles, and it goes into the swag collection. There it is. Okay, Dar. Do we need to know some little basic term? Well, you know what? Before we even get into why is disaster recovery and the related and included backup so I don't know if it's just forgotten, ignored, not done well.
What inspired the session is an organization I used to work for. We were required by auditors to do a disaster recovery plan. So when it came time for the annual audit, I got out the current disaster recovery plan and went, all right, I'm going to go ahead and update this. And what I discovered when I read the plan was there were servers that were 8 years gone for the last 8 years on that plan.
That were
yes.
Gone. Yeah.
And reading the plan, it was very clear that what the previous person had done was simply change the date and update the plan for auditors. And as I thought about it and talked to other people, I found that actually happens a lot. DR is sort of that thing they don't have time for because no one ever thinks it'll happen to them.
Yeah.
So you push it off and you push it off, and you either just download the template, a template off the internet, and slap a date on it and basically fill it out just for the auditors. But a lot of organizations never actually think through their disaster recovery. They don't get into the details. They don't worry about it. And then when a disaster actually happens to them, they're sort of stuck.
Yeah,
they
now
either don't have a
serious,
plan, they don't have a functional
serious
plan.
Crisis.
Yeah, and they've never tried it out. So that was what inspired the session. And as we dug into it, we tried to give the 30,000-foot view because disaster recovery, there's an entire industry that deals with technology disaster recovery. You can spend days on this topic, and obviously we didn't have days. We had a 90-minute session. So we tried to give the 30,000-foot view of the practical items you need to pay attention to if you're not confident in your organization's DR plan, if you don't have a DR plan, or if you do and you really don't, you think it really needs an overhaul, sort of the top 10 of items of what you should really be looking at when you're dealing with disaster recovery and backups. And we tried to give several practical examples, myself and the other speaker, Andrew, who could not make it this morning, of disasters we've had to deal with as well as other well-known ones.
Yeah, okay. Do we need some basic language before we get into the DR, disaster recovery topic?
Sure, DR is one of them. Disaster recovery is often referred to as DR. It's often spoken about in terms of business continuity, or BC, which is sort of the larger plan for the entire organization should a disaster strike. There's very DR-specific things such as RPO, which is recovery point objective that we could talk about, or RTO, which is recovery time objective. There's very specific language like that for disasters. But it's usually just referred to as DRs.
All
so
right.
whenever we say DR, it's disaster recovery.
Okay, we'll see if we get into those.
Yeah, and
those
I can
two.
explain them as we go.
Okay. All right, so clearly we should have a disaster recovery disaster recovery plan, even if we're an organization that's small enough that doesn't have an annual audit.
Correct.
We still should have something in place.
Yes.
Okay. What belongs in our DR plan?
Top 10 things. You need a contact list for your team. So if
you have a top 10 of DR?
I do, of what should
DR
be in your DR plan.
Oh, that's outstanding. Okay.
Your DR plan, it can be anything from a 5-page outline that just covers the basics. And in our session slides, which I've posted in the NTC library, it gives some good resources for doing a DR plan. Or it can be a huge 100-page document that covers absolutely every aspect of business continuity, or something in between. It's going to vary by organization. And the reality is, if you're a small organization with a small small IT team, you might only be able to do the 5-page outline, but that's better than nothing. That's better than no DR plan, or a DR plan that realistically hasn't been updated in the last 10 years.
Yep.
But I would say, the top 10 you really should have in your DR plan is, number one, a contact list for your team members. What is the contact for your IT team folks or your business continuity folks? If you normally would get that out of your email and you're in a disaster situation, and you can't get to your email or anything like
as
that.
As we're going through, and I want listeners to know that she's doing this without notes.
I am.
I believe she seems very confident that she's got the top 10.
And hopefully I remember all 10
memorized.
from my
right.
notes.
Look, if we get 7 or 8 of 10, we'll be ecstatic. But
so contact list for your team.
but I wanted to say, as we're going through, consider two organizations that may not have someone devoted to IT.
Correct.
A lot of our listeners are small and mid-sized nonprofits.
Right. And
they may very well just all be outsourced, or it falls on the executive director's desk.
Excellent point, and we do cover
Okay.
that in the session. So to finish up the top 10, contact list for your team members, contact list for your vendors, a call tree and some sort of communications. How do you tell your organization and your members that you've had a disaster? Either your servers have gone down, your pipes have burst, and your communications are underwater. How do you do that? What does your network look like? So a network diagram, a process outline, how you're actually going to do your disaster recovery, a timeline, how long do you expect these activities to take before you can be live again, a list of systems and applications that you're going to recover. If you're a large enough org, or you can afford a hot site, what's called a hot or a warm site, where you can immediately switch over to other equipment, information about that. You'd need that to start your recovery. And then also information about your backups. Who's got your backups? What system are you using? How do you, get those back? So those are sort of like the top 10 things your DR plan should have.
All right. Let's dive into the process a bit, because that intrigues me. And hopefully listeners, I think so. I think I have a fair bead on what's interesting. I hope I do. How do we start to think about what our DR process should be?
First, you have to think about what all could be a disaster for your organization. A lot of people think about things, earthquakes, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, but it could also be water pipes bursting in your building. That's one of the most common things.
If your server is not properly protected, which a lot aren't, a lot are stuck in closets, a dripping pipe.
Water, we call those water events, and that seems to be the most common thing IT departments encounter is leaking pipes in the building or some sort of a flooding situation. But it could also be an electronic disaster, such as I've worked at an organization that underwent what's called a DDoS attack, which is a distributed denial of service. It took out our entire web presence because a malicious hacker went after us.
That's where there's millions of
they use a bot network and they just flood your network
in seconds.
With it.
And you're overloaded and shut down.
And that's a disaster situation. So
why were they attacked like that? Why was a nonprofit attack malicious?
It was the NAACP.org, and we were attacked after the Trayvon Martin decision. Folks attacked our petition site.
Son of a gun.
Yeah.
Okay.
We were able to get it back online, but for a couple of hours, we were offline.
Okay.
And that can be considered a disaster situation.
For sure.
Yeah.
How do you help us think through what potential disasters are? How do you even identify them all?
Think about what could affect your org. Where are you vulnerable? Some of the things we talked about in the session were think about, how would you get back online if these various things happen to you? Are your services sort of in the cloud? Do you have servers on site? And start there when thinking about your process is what would you have to recover if these various scenarios affected you, or would these various scenarios affect you? If your website is completely outsourced to a vendor that has DDoS protection, okay, that's not a scenario you have to worry about. So kind of analyze it, and every org is going to be different. If you live on the West Coast, you're probably concerned more about earthquakes than other regions. So it's going to vary for each organization what sort of disaster you're going to be worried about. And then you start getting down into the practical nuts and bolts in terms of who are your disaster recovery people, who's your team. If you're a really small org, that might just be you. Or as you mentioned before, if you're using outsourced managed service provider and your vendor's responsible for that, make sure your vendor has a DR plan for you. A lot of folks just assume your vendor's taking care of that, but when it comes right down to it, do they actually have DR experience? Can they recover your items? Actually sit down and have that conversation, because so many of the small orgs, as you pointed out, do use outsourced IT these days. And there's a lot of managed service providers that specialize in nonprofit IT, but you need to have that conversation. Don't wait till you're under a disaster disaster scenario to discover that, oops, they don't actually have that experience. Have that conversation ahead of time.
Okay. What else belongs in our process outline?
In your process outline, if you've got another site, either a cold, a warm, or a hot site, or if your stuff is based in the cloud, where would you recover to?
Now, the hot site is someplace you go to. What's the difference between cold, warm, and hot?
Sure.
Yeah.
A cold site would be where you've got another location. Let's say you have a dozen servers at your location, and in the case of your building being inaccessible or underwater, a cold site would be where you've got another location you can go to, but you don't really have any equipment staged there, but it is another location you can begin operations out of. That's a cold site.
Okay.
There's nothing ready to go, but you've got a site. A warm site would be where you sort of have skeletal equipment there. It's far less capacity than you're currently at, but you've got something there. It's not live, but you've got stuff ready to go that you can restore to and get going. And a hot site is where you can flip over immediately. You're live replicating to somewhere else. It's ready to go. It might not be full capacity, so it might not have a full-blown data line size that you're used to. Might not have your full range of servers, but it is live, and you could switch over near instantaneously. That's a hot site.
Okay.
So you'd want that in your process. And you're going to want to think about what are you restoring, and that's where we get into the backups. What comes first, and that's where you start getting into terms such as recovery point objective and recovery time objective. Those are two very common DR terms. Recovery time is how far back are you recovering to? And what does that mean for each system? So if it's your donor system, that's probably fairly critical. You want a recent restore of that. If it's a system that doesn't change very much, maybe a week ago restore is okay for that. That's recovery point objective. Recovery time objective is how long does it take you to get back online after a disaster?
Okay.
If you've got to download your data from an external source, has anyone thought about how long that's going to take you to get the data back? Is it going to take you 15 hours or 3 days? So and a lot of folks don't think about that ahead of time. They just go, we'll pull it back down if we have a disaster. But they don't think about, instead of their nice normal data communications, they're going to be on a tiny DSL line trying to pull down 150 gigs of information, and it's going to take a week to get it back down.
I have to say, you're very good about explaining terms. And
Thank you.
Nonprofit radio, we have jargon jail.
Yes, we try not to.
You haven't transgressed because you're immediate about explaining exactly what recovery point and recovery time objectives are.
It can be very confusing, if you don't understand the terms in tech. It can be confusing what folks are talking about, and that was one of the focuses of our session, is making it less confusing and being very practical about what you can or cannot do. And if folks go and look at our slides, they'll see on several of the items we did a good, better, best. And we tried to talk about that all throughout the session because we realized, again, for a small org or even a large org that just doesn't have the resources to devote to it, you might not be able to do best practice.
Yes.
But you could at least try a good practice that would be better than nothing. And then so we do a good, better, best for each type of thing, like what does a good DR plan look like versus a best DR plan, and at least try and get to that good, because then at least you'll have something. And it can be a continuum where you try and improve it along the way, but you got to start somewhere. It's better than just ignoring it, which is what happens at a lot of places.
Do we need to prioritize what's mission critical and what we can work without for a time?
Yes.
How do we determine that?
Definitely. We talk about that in terms of it's not just an IT decision either, because we may think that the email is the most critical thing out there, but development may see the donor system as the most critical out there. Program might think that the case management system is the most critical out there. So you
Finance wants their accounting.
Exactly. They want their accounting system up. Obviously, you've got to have an order in which you bring these things up. You're probably not going to have enough staff or bandwidth or equipment to bring everything back online. So there needs to be, and hopefully your executive team would be involved in deciding for the organization what is most critical in what order are you going to bring those things up, and that needs to be part of your DR plan, because otherwise if you're in a disaster scenario, you're not going to know where to start, and there's going to be a lot of disagreement of who starts where. So you guys need to decide on the order.
Okay. We still have a few minutes left. What more can we say about DR and the related backup? Let's not go into detail on the backup, but because I think
we can do a little bit in terms of DR. I would say the key points on backups are check them, because a lot of times,
right? Monthly or quarterly at least.
Is anyone looking at your backups?
Can we actually back up? Does it work? Does the darn thing work?
One of the scenarios that we talked about that actually happened to my co-speaker Andrew was that their server room flooded. And it hit their Razor's Edge server, which is their entire CMS or CRM and donor system. And they thought it was backing up. but no one had actually checked the backups in the last 2 months.
And it was not.
And it was not.
Oh, my.
So in terms of backup, just typical, pay attention to the maintenance. What are you backing up? Has anyone checked it? And again, if you're using a managed service provider, make sure if they're responsible for looking at your backups and managing them, make sure they're doing that. Double check them. Make sure that they understand that your backups are critical and they can't just ignore the alerts about your backups. You don't want to be in the unpleasant situation of 3 of our servers just got flooded. We need the data and discover nobody was backing it up.
It ain't there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else you want to leave people about backup before we go to the broader DR?
No, I think that's good.
Okay.
Those are the highlights for it.
All right. So back to the disaster recovery. What more can we say about that?
There are going to be a lot of gotchas if you're in a large DR situation. And so one of the things we stress is, one, getting down into the details of your DR plan before a disaster hits. Because if you've never thought about how you're actually going to do the restores or actually how you're going to rebuild those servers, so you need to ahead of time.
We're practicing our plan, rehearsing.
Yeah. A lot of folks never practice.
We got to have a fire drill. I hate fire drills.
But you don't want to have a live fire drill.
Yeah.
In this case, it might be a live fire drill. You don't want to have that.
Okay.
So you should make some effort to practice, even if it's just something small, trying to restore one server. I mentioned in this session that I was put in a situation years ago at Johns Hopkins University where we were required to have verification of live DR practice. So I was put in a room that had a table, a telephone, a server, and we were carrying 2 laptops, and we couldn't come out of the room until we had completely restored our domain. We had a set of backups on a thumb drive and added the second laptop to that domain and proved that we had restored the domain, and an independent person that was not connected to our department was monitoring to make sure we had done it, and we had to prove it. And that was an eye-opening experience. As experienced as I was at doing that, I'd never done it live, and it took me 3 tries to do it. So that's where I would encourage folks to really try and practice this stuff ahead of time and get down into the weeds on their DR plan, and also to think about it.
You weren't fired because it took you 3 times.
No, we completed it.
Is that why you left Johns Hopkins?
No.
Okay.
I actually liked my job at Johns Hopkins.
Okay.
No, we did complete it within the time frame, but we were a little startled when we discovered that we thought we knew how to do it first time out, and we kept making little mistakes. There were 2 of us in there doing it, and we were surprised at ourselves that we thought, oh, of course we know this. This is not a problem. But no, we were making little mistakes because we didn't have the documentation down as specific as it needed to be. And so that was a very eye-opening experience.
All right.
There's a couple other DR gotchas we talk about, which is
please.
cost. People don't think about the cost ahead of time. How much is it going to cost to get you that data back? In the instance of my co-presenter who had the damaged drives, they weren't expecting a near $10,000 cost to recover those drives. But that's what happened when they didn't have the backups. They had to take those hard drives to a data recovery place, and the price tag was nearly $10,000. And dealing with insurance is another big one that people don't think about. Having to account for all of the equipment that was lost and dealing with that insurance morass often gets dumped on the IT department in a small organization. There's not, a legal department that's going to deal with that. It's going to be you. So to, kind of talk to your insurance provider ahead of time and see what all you have to deal with in a disaster situation so you don't get an unpleasant surprise if you're ever in one.
And as well, on the insurance topic, just are you covered?
Exactly. Are you covered?
What is covered?
Exactly. Is your equipment covered? And what do you have to do with that in terms of accounting for it if you suffer a disaster?
Any other gotchas? We got still a couple more minutes if
we could go on for days about gotchas.
Well, go ahead, please. Not days. Share.
Trying to think about some other ones.
Don't hold back on nonprofit radio.
Trying to think of some of the other ones that we covered in there. The equipment, again, to the cost. How much is it going to cost you to get new equipment? And did you account for that when you were doing your DR plan? And time to recover. A lot of folks don't understand how long it may take them to do a recovery. And also deciding what is important and what is not important, not just in terms of what should be restored in what order, but in terms of practical things. Do you really need to restore your domain, or could you just start over from scratch? If your domain only contains maybe 50 accounts and doesn't have any associated servers, is it faster for you to just start over and just recreate the domain immediately, especially if a lot of your emails in Office 365 or Google Apps, you could reconnect it very quickly. So, thinking about more practical gotchas like that you should think about ahead of time. Obviously that's the best practice to think of all these details, and we realize folks may not be able to. So we provided some worksheets and some samples of them of just quick yes or no questions and thinking this through and things to think about.
And where will we? That is not nonprofit
that was not
radio.
Us.
Nonprofit radio has professional sound. I don't know about NTC and NTEN, but
that was a whale over in the other aisle.
They're on their own. They can come to us for expertise if they need to, but. See, now I messed myself up. I was going
Sorry
to ask you
about
about
that.
something. What were you just talking about? You were just,
How long it will actually take you to recover things, and whether or not you should practically skip recovering something because it might be faster to rebuild it.
okay. I had a follow-up to that. And
Mhm.
so my smart-ass
That's okay.
humor made me lose it. All right.
That's okay.
Okay, why don't you leave us with one takeaway, DR or backup?
The session was a little bit misnamed because technically you're not going to avoid a disaster. You really can't in many cases. You're not going to avoid the flood. You're not going to avoid the earthquake if you're in that region. So you need to plan on how to deal with it. So it's more like avoiding your DR becoming the disaster, because you're not going to avoid the disaster itself, so you might as well plan for it.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Dar.
Thank you much.
Dar Veverka, Vice President of Technology for Lyft. This is Tony Martignetti nonprofit radio coverage of NTC, the Nonprofit Technology Conference 2015. Thank you so much for being with us.